let's talk about it. Gluten versus pesticides. Again, what I said earlier is that so many people are talking about how they're going to start eating gluten again because they read from some blog or from some post that really gluten sensitivity is a myth and it's not really a problem or an issue, and that it's really just has to do more with pesticide than anything else. And so, again, I wanted to spend some time addressing that because it's quite ridiculous to take what we know from all the way from 1952 about gluten causing not just celiac disease, but multiple forms of autoimmunity, and just completely dismissing all of that science because somebody somewhere at some point, I don't know who it was who started the rumor, but just started to talk about how gluten wasn't even an issue. So let's kind of dive into that, because one of the most predominant pesticides that gets used today is the pesticide Roundup, otherwise known as glyphosate. A lot of people are familiar with this, and I'm going to put up some links because I've interviewed some of the leading experts on the topic, and I'm going to direct you back to those. But glyphosate is one of those things that's been being used for about the last 30 years. It's being used more and more aggressively, particularly on wheat, but also on corn and other GMO-based crops, and even non-GMO crops. Some of the wheat crops that are non-GMO but hybridized are using glyphosate 2-3 times before harvest. So they put it on the ground before, they put it on the ground during, and then they spray the field one more time to dry out the wheat faster so they can harvest it quicker. So is that a problem? Absolutely, it is a problem. Let's talk about why. Can glyphosate be a poison? Yeah, in strong doses. That's why when you see people applying glyphosate, they're wearing protection. They're wearing the chemical protection, the gas mask protection with carbon filters in it, because they don't want to poison themselves. It's a very toxic substance. Remember, it's designed to kill. That's its whole premise. Now, glyphosate was originally designed as a chelating agent. So it's one of its jobs is it binds metals so that metals can't be used by plants, basically. And that in and of itself inhibits a biological pathway called the shikimate pathway. Now, if it's doing that in humans, it can create a major problem with serotonin production. So overexposure to glyphosate can theoretically create a serotonin disruption that remembers what serotonin does. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter, and about 90% of it is made in the gut. So big part of serotonin's function is gut motility and gut regulation of bowel movements. So a lot of people developing irritable bowel syndrome from eating grain that's been sprayed with glyphosate. But remember, some serotonin also used in the brain, so we can see side effect of depression. We can see neurological inflammation as a result of that deficit. So that there's definitely a correlation between glyphosate and that process happening. And so again, is that a problem? Yes, it is a problem. Does that mean that gluten is automatically safe and that glyphosate is the only problem? No. So let's talk about, again, we've got glyphosate as a potential disruptor of the microbiome. We've got glyphosate as a chelating agent that can bind up metals, causing malabsorption and mineral deficiency issues. We've got glyphosate that potentially can interfere with something called the shikimate pathway, which is important for serotonin production. So there certainly are mechanisms at play where glyphosate can basically worsen an already bad situation, especially if somebody's gluten sensitive. So now you take somebody with gluten sensitivity who's eating grain and they are sick already, but now you add glyphosate as a secondary poison. So gluten's a poison to that person, but also glyphosate's a poison. And so now they're getting hit from two different angles. So keep that in mind. Now, whereas gluten has been shown to create villous atrophy in the GI tract, so it can damage the intestinal lining, leading to a flattening of the villi. Remember what the villi are. They're the organelle, or the organ rather, inside, not really an organ, but part of the tissue inside the cilia, the microcilia, that expand the small intestine's surface area, that helps to increase absorption of vitamins and minerals. So as we start flattening those villi out, we lose surface area and we can start to have malabsorption and maldigestion. And for a lot of people that have celiac disease, that can lead to chronic diarrhea. But for many, it doesn't lead to chronic diarrhea at all, but it does create the gastrointestinal inflammation and the villous atrophy. It just doesn't manifest as diarrhea. For some people, the gluten exposure causes just the GI inflammation without the villous atrophy. In essence, the GI inflammation is there, but no villous atrophy was identifiable on a biopsy. But gluten still being a problem. And for others, and this was discovered at the University of Maryland several years ago, It was Dr. Fasano, Licio Fasano, and I'm going to put up an interview I did with Dr. Fasano a few years ago for you if you want to check that out. He discovered that gluten could actually contribute to leaky gut. Now, leaky gut, understand that leaky gut is a precursor. It's a precursor to, for a lot of people, it's a precursor to autoimmune disease. So again, if you're eating grain or gluten and you're getting that exposure and that's creating or contributing to a leaky gut, then now food chemicals and other particles can microscopically leak through your gastric barrier into your immune system, overstimulating your immune system, which over time leads to this process called molecular mimicry. And that is, again, that's one of the big precursors to intestinal permeability or leaky gut. I just posted in the feed an article with that interview with Dr. Fasano. So for many of those of you who want to go learn a little bit more about leaky gut after the show tonight, that's going to be up there for you to go check out. Let's see here. Okay, we got Lisa from England chiming in, Kimberly from Oklahoma, and Darcy from Kansas, and Melissa from South Carolina, and Solaris from Colorado. Well, a lot more folks tuning in. And we got one from Puerto Rico, Liz Esther. I think I said that right. Hope I said that right. Welcome to the show. Stephanie from Arizona. Kayla from Eek. No, just kidding. Tracy chiming in. Tracy Thomas, welcome back. You've been absent for a while, so nice to see you back on as a guest all the way from Milwaukee. So, okay, going back to glyphosate and gluten. So what we were just talking about is some of the mechanisms of action of what glyphosate can do. Now, it's it's very common for glyphosate to be used more commonly today than, again, let's just say 10 years ago, 15 or 20 years ago. A lot of farmers are picking it to spray on the crop right before harvest because it dries it out and makes it easier to harvest the crop. So a lot of these crops are getting extra doses of poison. And so, for some people, what they perceive, to understand what you perceive to be gluten sensitivity, a lot of people think they have gluten sensitivity because of the way they feel when they eat grains. And they may. Again, the difference between whether you have gluten sensitivity and whether you have pesticide poisoning, or whether you have both, if you haven't been tested, it doesn't matter, because your perception of eating that food and the way that you feel and the sickness that it creates for you is very, very real, regardless of whether you've been tested. So, but in the sake of, for clarity's sake, understand that gluten sensitivity very uniquely is the state of genetics. You either have the genes for gluten sensitivity, that when you eat grains that contain gluten, you will have an immune system response that leads to chronic inflammation, or you don't have those genes. So if you don't have those genes and you're eating grain-based foods and you're reacting to them, it very well could be that it's not gluten at all, but it's the pesticide. So keeping that in mind, going back to what we're talking about tonight, gluten versus pesticide, if you don't have clarity and you don't know, I'm not a big fan of just restricting people's diets just because. I'd like to restrict diets for objective reasons that will help, that we know can predictably help improve someone's health. So if you're not really gluten sensitive, does that mean that that you can eat grain? Potentially, yes, it does, provided that the grain isn't loaded up with other chemical processed toxins, such as glyphosate. And atrazine is another chemical that we commonly find, atrazine, used on a number of different crops. Actually, let me spell that right for you, because it's actually atrazine, not atro, but atrazine. And atrazine is an herb. It's an herb and weed killer, and it's used very, very predominantly on many crops, and sprayed. And we also get water and groundwater contamination, especially in our riverbeds, where we've seen atrazine contaminating rivers to such a great degree that a lot of the fish, a lot of the frogs, a lot of the lizards and salamanders, we're seeing chemical castration of the male species. So in essence, the chemical atrazine mimics estrogen so significantly that it leads to a sex change in the animals. And that's been very, very well studied. As a matter of fact, all you have to do is look up atrazine toxicity or atrazine mimicking estrogen, and you'll find more than you could possibly read and more research than you could possibly imagine on how that particular chemical can lead to an hyperestrogenic exposure to animals, again, leading to major problems. So atrazine is another one of those pesticides that, as an artificial estrogen for men, can create very big hormonal disruption, and for women can create hormonal disruption. Hyperestrogenism, or an estrogen estrogen progesterone ratios are very important to balance. And a lot of functional medicine doctors will prescribe hormones to try to balance that out. But if a person is consistently eating a food that's contaminated with atrazine, or that has atrazine in it, where they're getting a high enough of an estrogen exposure, it can send them into a state of estrogen dominance, and that can lead to, disruption of the cycle, disruption of the period, and can create all kinds of problems. And we've seen it related to infertility issues. We've seen it related to, in men, we've seen it related to gynecomastia, meaning men start to grow female breast tissue because of the excessive estrogen. So this can be a really serious problem. And again, is it gluten, or is it glyphosate? Is it atrazine? So gluten versus pesticides, a very, very real and very, very valid question, although I don't think we throw away gluten as not being potentially problematic just because we know that pesticides can be. And for many people, it's both. It's gluten and it's pesticide. It's not one or the other. It's both. And remember that there is no healthy dose of pesticide. So a lot of people are like, well, what's a safe dose of the pesticide? Well, there are doses of pesticides that humans can tolerate without dying. And so that oftentimes gets considered to be safe for use. But remember the history of pesticide use in the United States. A lot of the chemicals that were once used are now banned because they're known carcinogens, or they're now banned because the health impact and the health effect on humans was so great, but it was only recognized as that great after years and years of experimenting on humans. So again, what we oftentimes get told, which is, oh, these things are safe, they've been studied, nobody's dying left and right. Look, people are not being poisoned acutely by these things where they're dying the next day from exposure. It's not an issue of acute poisoning. It's an issue of chronic exposure leading to chronic deterioration in health. And that's very, very hard to prove in a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial, because you can't control for all the variables, because people live life, and life is a huge variable, and stress is a variable, and exercise, and sunshine, and sleep, and the diet, and all these different changes in a person's day-to-day are a variable. So it's very, very hard to control. Is it the pesticide? Is it the gluten? Is it something else in that person's life? So you're never going to really find a major study. What we're going to find is epidemiological data, meaning collected data over years and years and years of you being a guinea pig, if you choose to make yourself a guinea pig, of these chemical exposures. And that's why I recommend, look, let's just rule out the pesticide altogether. Don't eat non-organic food. If you're buying food that's not organic, you're getting exposed to pesticide, you're getting exposed to GMO ingredient, you're running a risk for being a part of the experiment in America, this agricultural experiment where we do things that aren't really scientifically proven to be safe, but they're being called safe. And what we're seeing is more and more illness cropping up as the years go by. So my advice to you is, don't be the person who allows everyone else to treat you like the guinea pig. And at the very least, if you're not sure whether you're gluten sensitive, you should be buying organic sprouted grains as opposed to not. And if you were gluten sensitive, it doesn't matter. The pesticide is irrelevant. That part's irrelevant. You shouldn't be eating grain if you're gluten sensitive. So hopefully that clears that issue up a little bit. Now, one of the other things I did want to bring up is, and if you've got questions that you want to ask, make sure, go ahead and start typing those in now, because it's a first come, first serve basis. And I'm going to answer them as they come at me. So another big one that has been really, really popular, that's been coming into Gluten-Free Society. And those of you who don't know what Gluten-Free Society is, it's my foundation. And if you're not subscribed to our newsletter, go over to glutenfreesociety.org. That's glutenfreesociety.org, and make sure you're signed up. And when you sign up, we'll send you a gluten-free survival kit for free. And it's just got a lot of really great information to help you on your gluten-free journey. But one of the things is, it's been coming up, at least through the question line at Gluten-Free Society, is sourdough safe? because a lot of people are also promoting, sourdough bread as an alternative. And the claim is that, to create sourdough, you basically use, in a sense, it's a bread ferment. So there's some fermentation process that happens with sourdough bread. And they're claiming that it minimizes, or the bacteria themselves will eat up the gluten. And so the bread is safer. Look, if you're gluten sensitive, 20 parts per million is all it takes to create an inflammatory response for as long as 2 months. So it doesn't matter whether the bread is sourdough or not. It is not safe if you're gluten sensitive. And again, that comes back to, how do you know if you're gluten sensitive or not? You should get tested. If you don't know, don't guess at the diet. It's, understand that if you're guessing at the diet and you guess wrong, the ultimate price that you pay for eating gluten over a lifetime and being gluten sensitive is cancer. There's a particular type of cancer called lymphoma, which is one of the worst outcomes, or one of the worst scenarios for somebody with a gluten sensitivity issue, where they completely ignore it. But there are other outcomes as well. And, outcomes are relative. You ask yourself, would I rather have lymphoma, or would I rather have rheumatoid arthritis, or would I rather have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, or would I rather have eczema, or would I rather have vitiligo? It's all based on the eye of the beholder, right? The disease is basically the perception of the person who has the disease. That is it worse? Is it better? To me, they're all bad. And if you really want to know whether a gluten-free diet is the right thing to do, you really have to get genetically tested. If you're looking at, there are a lot of different tests for gluten sensitivity. Most of them are, it's not that they're inaccurate, it's that they're not sensitive enough. So by the time the damage is been done, that you can get the testing done early, like antibody testing and even the endoscopy for the villus atrophy. But oftentimes those tests come back negative, because there's not enough severe damage yet. So by the time the damage is so severe, you've waited 20, 30, 40 years, and you've gotten that accumulated decades of inflammatory damage before you get a diagnosis or before you get an answer. So if you really want to know whether or not you have a gluten issue, hands down, the absolute best way to determine that is to have genetic testing. And I'll put information about that up in the feed for you as well. So again, genetic testing, if you want to know whether or not the gluten-free diet is the right move for you, and you really want to commit to it in the appropriate way, then you want to get genetic testing, because you can't trick genetic testing. Understand that a lot of these tests for gluten sensitivity, the doctor, even though you might feel better not eating gluten, the doctor will tell you eat gluten for 3 months, then come back. So if you feel horrible eating gluten, then they're going to send you home until you feel bad for the next 3 months so that we can give you an answer. And the testing that we're going to use, by the way, is not all that accurate unless it's positive. But if it's negative, you could get a false negative result, and I could have just told you to feel bad for the next 3 months so that we could get no further. If you want to get accurate assessment of whether going gluten-free is the right move for you, you really need to look at genetic testing. It's the only accurate way to do it. And you don't have to be eating gluten to get an accurate answer, because your genes don't change. Either you have these gene patterns or you don't have these gene patterns. And if you do, and you're eating gluten, again, that's going to cause that chronic inflammation for you. Let's see here. We got some questions coming in. So, I love this question. Thanks for asking it, Misty. Just because you have the genes that indicate gluten sensitivity, how does one know they're turned on? Well, here's the thing, Misty. What turns those genes on is gluten exposure. So, and I mean, we don't have a little microscope where we can look inside of your white blood cells, on the surface of your white blood cells, and look at whether or not your HLA-DQ alpha-1 and beta-1 gene are reacting right this very second. We don't have that microscope. But what we know is when you have exposure to gluten and you have HLA-DQ gene patterns that are positive for gluten, you're going to turn that gene on to create an inflammatory response, because those individuals with positive gluten sensitivity genes, the reason those genes are being turned on is to deal with the gluten. It's to deal with it. It's to create the inflammation, to attack the gluten, to get rid of it. So understand that that's a big part of what happens. Having the genes means the way you activate them is by eating gluten, and the way you turn them off and keep them silent is by not exposing them to gluten. So it's the gene activation is as a result of your diet. And that's why it's the best and most accurate way to look at it. That's why also gluten sensitivity is not a disease. Gluten sensitivity is a state of genetics. If you ignore what your genes are designed to do, then the outcome will be sickness. Just like, I mean, let me give you another example. This is a little bit more acutely of an example, but try to go underwater and breathe. You know, If you try to go underwater and breathe, I can guarantee you will not grow gills. Your genes will not adapt so that you grow gills so that you can extrapolate oxygen from the water. What will happen is you will choke and you will drown if you stay under it, right? That's a perfect example of putting your genes in an environment that's not conducive for their survival. Well, people with gluten-sensitive genes, eating gluten is the same example, only it doesn't kill you right now. It creates inflammation. And if you do it today and then you do it again tomorrow and you do it again the next day and then you multiply that by 5 years and 10 years, you're creating a chronic state of inflammation. So your body's just chronically, instead of your food nourishing you, you're just chronically being bombarded and you're attacking your food. You're creating an inflammatory response against the very thing that's supposed to nourish you. And that's one of the reasons why it can create so many problems. So I'm glad you asked that question, and hopefully that clarifies it for you. So Pamela's asking, what test can we get to show gluten sensitivity? Pamela, I answered that question, and I posted a link to genetic testing for gluten sensitivity in the feed there. So make sure you go back and look at that. Okay. Liz DeVivo, what about organic grains? So we had that conversation. Maybe if you tuned in late, go back and listen to the first 10 minutes or so, because I covered that answer for you in that. If you're gluten sensitive, organic grains are not okay. Carol is chiming in from Ohio. Hi, Carol. Nice to see you on board this evening. Let's see. Aaron from Rhode Island. Joanne. Nice to have you all here tonight. Meryl is asking, is there a cure for it? So Meryl, can I get you to type back in a cure for what? Because I'm not quite sure what you mean when you ask, is there a cure for it? Because I've talked about a lot of things. So rephrase that question and we'll get an answer for you. So Melissa, I'm not gluten sensitive, but choose not to eat it due to Hashimoto's. I would argue that you probably are gluten sensitive if you have Hashimoto's. I've got data that shows in thousands and thousands of cases, actually, in every case of Hashimoto's that I've ever seen walk through my office doors, we've got genetic testing that reveals gluten sensitivity, positivity in every single case. So I don't know if you've ever been tested, Melissa, but I'm glad you're avoiding it nonetheless. Let's see here. Oh, good. Another good question. What about einkorn wheat? So there was actually a study published on this. Einkorn wheat is no healthier if you're gluten sensitive. Einkorn wheat is not gluten-free. And people oftentimes use this term ancient, like ancient grains, right? You hear this, ancient that, as if somehow because it's ancient, it delineates that it's healthier. Understand that, yes, today our world is exposed with lots of pollutants and lots of toxins, but our world is not this horrible place that a lot of people make it out to be. I mean, we have modern technologies and we have farming conveniences, and we have factors that make life so much easier and so much more convenient. And those things aren't necessarily evil or bad just because they're new, just because they represent modern technology. Now, that being said, on the same token, things that are older are not necessarily healthier. People have had problems with, as a matter of fact, the oldest known recording of gluten sensitivity is pre-biblical. There's texts that are pre-biblical in nature before the Bible, talking about something called the celiac affliction. So we've known about celiac. It's been around for a very long time, even in the ancient world. So just because a grain is ancient, like einkorn, which is einkorn is a less hybridized and a less manipulated form of grain, doesn't make it any healthier for somebody with gluten sensitivity. So, and there's actually research where they tested that and people still reacted to the einkorn. So again, it's not any healthier, Mary, and I'm glad you asked that question. Thanks for chiming in. Oh, look at this here. This is a good comment. Denise is saying, I worked in a commercial greenhouse back in the 70s and used DDT, a lot of other nasty chemicals. Reading Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was a game life changer for me. Thank you for your info. Oh, you're welcome, Denise. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I was talking about a minute ago. And that, DDT is one of those chemicals today that is in the US, you can't use it. So it's banned because of its known damaging properties, its known dangers. So, but how many years did we use it before it was banned? As a matter of fact, I've got family members that were farmers that used to run behind the truck when the truck was just squirting out the DDT, and they would play in the cloud. So again, we know that today. We know that it's dangerous today because of years and years of use and exposure and illnesses. So I think we're going to see the same thing happening with some of these other pesticides, particularly glyphosate. Barbara, hi. Nice to have you on the show tonight, Barbara. Let's see. Any symptoms from gluten or gluten-free? I'm not sure I understand your question, Carol. Let's see. Yvonne is asking, can you breathe in gluten? Does it affect your lungs? Yes, it does. Interesting. I'm gonna put up a link here for you. Let me find it. I want to put it up because I think it's I think it'll definitely be helpful for you to understand this. So one of the earliest known effects of gluten was a disease called Baker's asthma. And so when you're asking me if you breathe in gluten, does it affect you? The answer is absolutely it does. And asthma is one of the ways that it can affect you. So I'm going to put a link up here on Baker's asthma in the feed, and you can read more about Baker's asthma and breathing in gluten particles. Here's an interesting story on that same note. One time we had somebody come in. She was we tested her. She was positive for gluten sensitivity. She cut all the known gluten out of her diet. All the grain was cut out of her diet, but she was still struggling, couldn't find out why. We were really at a lack for an answer until I dove a little bit more into her job history, into her work. And one of the things I found out is she worked next door to a bakery, and the bakery in her office building shared the same air ducts. So they were making fresh flour. They're throwing all that dust, that flour dust up in the air. And so she was breathing in through her air duct. She was breathing in wheat particulate on a daily basis. And that was one of the reasons why she couldn't get better. Well, when we figured that out and she got out of that environment, she made a full recovery. So again, to answer your question, definitely breathing in gluten can affect your lungs. Let's see here. Barbara, I'm not sure I understand your question. I have the gene and the wheat allergy. How should I approach them? If you've got the genes for gluten sensitivity, the way you approach that is you quit eating grain. If you're also wheat allergic, obviously, if you're avoiding grain, you're also avoiding wheat. So that would be the way I'd answer that. If you need better clarification, just type it in and ask that question in a different way. What about sprouted buckwheat flour? So good question, Robin. I don't recommend it. I don't recommend any of the pseudo grains. The pseudo grains are buckwheat, amaranth, and quinoa. And again, any of you who have read No Grain, No Pain probably already know this. I wrote the book basically to answer a lot of these questions, but buckwheat, one of the problems with buckwheat, and especially in the United States, is cross-contamination. It's cross-contamination in the fields, cross-contamination in the factories that produce it. And there was a recent study done in the US where 41% of these products were actually cross-contaminated with enough gluten to create a problem. So that's a high percentage, 41%. So don't recommend buckwheat flour, whether it's sprouted or whether it's not, because of major cross-contamination issues. Also don't recommend pseudo grains, buckwheat, amaranth, and quinoa. They're seeds, and they contain other proteins that are known to incite inflammation in the GI tract of humans. And in particular, many of them will actually produce or activate a particular receptor in your GI tract called the toll-like receptor. And this toll-like receptor is responsible for creating gastrointestinal inflammation. So these pseudo grains, they have that capacity to do that. And that's another reason why I recommend avoidance, especially if you're just brand new to all this and you're trying to get healthy and you're struggling with a chronic autoimmune problem and you've got lots of inflammation. And you're going gluten-free, but a lot of people, when they go gluten-free, they just gravitate toward quinoa or buckwheat substitutes or amaranth substitutes, and they don't get better. And this is one of the reasons why: either cross-contamination or proteins, seed-based proteins that are just as potently powerful at damaging the gut lining and creating inflammation, or posing a problem for the digestive tract to properly break these foods down. So don't recommend them for that reason. Oh, good question, Holly. Does gluten sensitivity affect the ability to lose weight? Absolutely, it does. I just did an interview today with with a nurse practitioner. She's putting on a weight loss summit, and this was the very topic that we discussed. And there's something called the gluten muscle wasting cycle. And what happens, Holly, is the more exposure that you have to gluten, again, this is if you're gluten sensitive. If you're gluten sensitive and you're being exposed to gluten, that creates a chronic source of inflammation. Now, one of the things that your body does when it's chronically inflamed is it produces the hormone cortisol. So it produces more and more cortisol. This cortisol is an anti-inflammatory. It's our body's natural way to fight inflammation. But cortisol, the untoward or the unwanted side effect of producing too much cortisol for too long a period of time is that it causes muscle wasting. So it causes your muscles, it shrinks them. It basically atrophies your muscle. And remember that the more muscle you have, the higher your metabolic rate. So if you're producing this chronic inflammation by your diet and you're producing a cortisol as an anti-inflammatory to combat the inflammation that your diet's creating, and it's causing your muscles to shrink, then your metabolism slows down, and now you're gaining weight eating the same amount of calories, because remember that big part of your metabolic rate is your muscle tissue. So if you're doing something that creates a chronic inflammatory response, it will cause muscle loss and muscle atrophy that will slow down your metabolism, creating a very, very big challenge in weight loss. And that's one of the mechanisms. There are several others. We won't get into all of them tonight. And if you want to read more about that, you can read more about the gluten muscle wasting cycle in No Grain, No Pain. You can pick that up at Barnes & Noble. You can pick it up on Amazon.com or any of the other major book publishing sites. Let's see here. So, yeah, Meryl, gluten sensitivity. My daughter has it. I'm worried about it. And does it affect fertility? Oh, gosh. We talked about this, 3 weeks ago? We did a whole show on fertility and gluten. And let's see if I can find that link for you, and I'll post it up. Let's see here. I'm looking for it right now. Let's see if we can pull it up. Here it is. So I'm going to post that for you right into the feed, just so you'll have that reference and that resource for your daughter. And but to answer your question, the simple answer is, can gluten cause infertility? Yes. As a matter of fact, most research studies that have been coming out on infertility, what's called unexplained infertility, it's now being recommended. The research scientists are saying if somebody has unexplainable infertility, then the very first thing they should have is a testing for gluten sensitivity to rule that out, because it's that common that it's a cause for infertility. So, okay. Okay, Brian, I've just acquired my copy of No Grain, No Pain. First page is read so far, but if I may ask, is there a difference between corn and maize? Is modified corn or maize starch safe on a gluten-free diet? Good question, Brian, and thank you for buying the book, and thank you for asking that question. No, corn and maize, there's not really a difference there. And if you're using corn starch or maize starch, it's not safe on a gluten-free diet. You should absolutely avoid it. And in particular, you should avoid it even more if it's coming from a genetically modified version of corn, because there's some research studies showing how that's even more potent and even more inflammatory. But here's a study that came out in 2012. A study came out on corn, and I'm going to post up some corn research for you, Brian, too, because I think it'll be helpful for you really in understanding this a little bit better. But a study came out in 2012, and this study was very unique in the sense that what it was studying was how corn gluten interacted with what's called the HLA-DQ receptor. Now, the HLA-DQ receptor is the same as what we do genetic testing on, is to see whether or not a person has the genes for gluten sensitivity. It's the HLA-DQ genes. But what we found is that gluten from corn interacted with this receptor, creating inflammation more aggressively than it did from wheat. So corn was actually worse in terms of the response than wheat. And again, that was a study published in 2012. I want to put up a list of studies for you on corn and corn gluten that you can get some more information about. I just put that up in the comments for you. Hopefully that'll help you understand that a little bit better. Oh, I like this question too. Another question from Misty. I'm curious if you have ever had a client that is a baker or pastry chef. If so, did they convert to a gluten-free lifestyle? I can only imagine how disruptive this could be on their career and lifestyle. How would you assist this person in changing their diet? I think if somebody's gluten sensitive and they're not willing to, and if they're a baker, they got to change their diet or they're going to die. I mean, it's really that simple. That's what it boils down to. They're going to create enough inflammation over time that it's going to end up shaving a decade off their life, and the quality of their life is going to be miserable at best. And to answer your question, and not a pastry chef, but I've had chefs. I've actually had a chef gluten sensitive with chronic immune issues. And what we did with him is we got him to do his chefing a little bit differently. I don't know if I said that right, if that's the proper term, chefing, but probably not. But no, what he actually ended up doing is he started a gluten-free kitchen. He started a grain-free kitchen. So he took his genetic issue and he converted what he was doing, and he became a chef that was providing these fabulous, fantastic tasting grain-free recipes for people. So he took his passion to a whole nother level, and he took his health to a whole nother level at the same time. Or is it how GM'd? I'm going to assume that means genetically modified wheat is now. It doesn't have the same molecular structure it used to. Personally, I think our bodies see a lot of our foods as foreign invaders because of all the messing around with it. We all know how our bodies react to foreign invaders. Sound familiar? So yeah, that's a great comment. Certainly but it isn't that. I mean, gluten is gluten regardless. And so even with and understand that there's no wheat that's genetically modified. The wheat is not genetically modified at all. When you do genetic manipulation of a food, you actually splice in new genes. You add new genetic material. That's what genetic manipulation is. But most of our wheat is hybridized, meaning they've taken different strains and different varieties and they've blended them together to get different characteristics or traits. That's genetic hybridization, and it's a very, very different thing. And genetic hybridization has been around as long as we've known farming. And so for thousands of years, genetic hybridization has been around. I would say, based on what your comment is saying, I'd say, yeah, it's based on the way we manipulate food for sure. But understand that wheat, from a gluten perspective, there's been no genetic manipulation. There's only been genetic hybridization that's done to wheat. But really, in my opinion, it's done post-market. So what's done post-production. So beyond the gluten, it's the mold that wheat tends to grow in high quantities. It's the mycotoxin quantities that are found in wheat because of modern commercial farming practices. It's the way we add bromine as a dough conditioner to the wheat. Bromine is it makes the gluten gluier. It makes it chewier. It's the way we add bleaching agents. It's the way we add hydrogenated fats and sugars. It's the way that we strip off the bran casing and take away any resemblance of what was a vitamin or a mineral, and then we add synthetic vitamins and minerals to it. So I think a lot of that, I think you're right in that thought process, Pat, and that it's a lot of those things for sure. But again, we can't forget about the gluten. One of the big points and highlights of tonight's show is it's not just the pesticide, it's the gluten too. And let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. Soon Thomas, is it good to eat almond flour instead of grain flour? It's a healthy substitute if you're gluten sensitive, but even too much almond flour is not good for you. Understand that almonds are very high in omega-6, and they can throw off your omega-6, omega-3 fatty acid balance and create a hyper-inflammatory response in people, even if you're not allergic to them. So I would just say, if you're going to use almond flour, use it sparingly. Don't batter everything in the world in almond flour, and don't look for almond bread, almond milk, almond this and almond that. Use it sparingly and in moderation. Let's see. So Sadai, I don't know if I said your name right, but I'm trying. Or Sada, I'm on a gluten-free diet for 8 years. I wonder if we will ever get rid of this disease, or we will have it forever, like as lifetime. Well, if you've been genetically tested positive for gluten sensitivity, it's not a disease. It's a lifetime diet change is all it is. So understand, it's not a disease at all. The disease comes if you eat the gluten, not if you avoid the gluten. So don't think of gluten sensitivity as a disease. Think of it as a blessing if you discover that you have those genes, because then at least you're empowered to change your diet and not struggle for years wondering why you're sick. Okay. Karen, I have been diagnosed with hyperparathyroidism with 4 growths on my parathyroid. I have eliminated grains for going on 3 years now. What is the difference between this and Hashimoto's, and are these permanent conditions even after the elimination of grain? Karen, it's a very, very broad question and hard for me to answer in that context. In my experience, this is the difference, first of all, between hyperparathyroidism. So parathyroid is different than the thyroid, right? The parathyroid regulates calcium, and a big part of how calcium gets in and out of the bone and how the calcium in your bloodstream is regulated at a tight control so that you don't have arrhythmias and die. So parathyroid is very, very important for calcium regulation. And yes, I've seen cases where people with gluten sensitivity had hyperparathyroidism because of gluten. And I've also seen, really where I've seen more issues with hyperparathyroidism is with vitamin D deficiency. So make sure your doctor has run your 25-OHD levels. If your vitamin D levels are below 20, then it's very possible that that's playing a role in creating too much parathyroid hormone that's leading to that problem. So that, again, that may be something you haven't had checked. Make sure you have it checked. No, it doesn't necessarily have to be a permanent condition, nor does Hashimoto's. I mean, Hashimoto's can be triggered. There are fundamental triggers to Hashimoto's, and one of them can be gluten. It's not the only one, but infection can be a trigger, and vitamin and mineral deficiency can be a trigger, as can chemical exposures or toxicities like heavy metals. Those can be a trigger. Mold exposure can be a trigger. So big part of answering that question is, have you identified all the potential known triggers and removed them from your diet, lifestyle, or environment? And if you haven't, then the likelihood that condition is going to go away is not very high. But if you have, then there is a likelihood that condition can go away. I've seen cases where people have done all the right diet and lifestyle changes and everything normalized. And that's the goal. That's the desired goal. So, hopefully shines a little bit of light and helps you get to the root cause of why you're struggling. Oh, thanks for chiming in, Aaron. I get short of breath if I walk down the bread aisle. I've seen that be the case. Some ultra-sensitive people, they walk down the bread aisle, or if they go into the store early in the morning when they're baking, it can actually make them sick. Let's see here. Can I mention inert ingredients? Yeah, I can, Tracy. Thank you. Tracy's asking if I can talk about the inert ingredients in medications. Many people are on medications, and I see this very commonly with people who are on thyroid medications, especially like Synthroid, because it's got corn in it. And again, if you're gluten sensitive and you're being medicated for a thyroid problem that's caused by gluten, and you're taking a medicine that contains corn gluten, even though it's technically considered gluten-free by the FDA because their definition of gluten is wheat, barley, and rye only, I've seen people end up in trouble over that. I've seen people not get better as a result of that. So that would be a perfect example of how medication and how an inert ingredient in a medication can continue to create problems. So if you have medicines that you're on, it's very important that you get with your doctor and you go through the inactive ingredient list and you cross-reference that for any hidden forms of gluten. And again, if you are struggling with knowing what those hidden forms of gluten are, make sure you sign up for Gluten-Free Society's newsletter, because it's one of the first things we send you is the master list, all the hidden ways that gluten can be found, not only in food and in cosmetics and other things, but also in your medications. Let's see here. On a gluten sensitivity diet, would you be better on a vegan diet, or are there other types of diet would you follow? Are there special doctors to get help? Yeah, I mean, Barbara, if you're a special doctor would be a functional medicine doctor. And they're more versed in the nutritional realm, whereas, your traditional medical doctors, they have less than 7 hours of nutritional training, most of them. And that's less than 7 hours. So think about that for a minute. The average nurse has 9 hours of nutritional training. The average doctor has less than 7. So the average nurse is actually more qualified to talk about nutrition than the average doctor. So a functional medicine doctor generally goes on postgraduate, does a lot more training in diet, lifestyle modification, and nutrition. So functional medicine doctor would be the right kind of doctor. Is a vegan diet better? No, that's somewhat of a myth. Now, there are some people that are better suited for vegetarianism, and there are some people that are better suited for for eating meat, and that's a unique, individualized thing that should be tested for, and that's where you get with a good functional medicine doctor who can run the appropriate testing to help you identify whether a vegan diet or a vegetarian diet is a better move or not, because not everybody is suited for a vegetarian diet. That's not a question. Let's see. Is there such a thing as gluten and aluminum-free baking powder? Yes, there is. And you can make it at home. A lot of people will do it homemade. You can Google search, grain-free baking powder recipes. Oh, I'm trying to remember the name off the top of my head. There's a couple different companies that use arrowroot in their baking powder instead of corn or instead of any type of wheat or aluminum. So if you type in arrowroot baking powder, you'll find that brand. I'm sorry, Aaron, I just can't remember the name off the top of my head. Sherry, if you're gluten sensitive, can your body ever heal to the point that you can eat it again? No, because, again, what created the damage in the first place? The gluten. So if you take it out and you heal to the point where you start introducing it again, what's going to happen is you're going to go back in the other direction again. So I don't ever recommend that somebody who's gluten sensitive who heals after going gluten free start eating gluten again because they're healed, because then they're just going to get sick again. Wow, this is a big question. What's my prediction for the future of food culture? Do I believe wheat and other grains will fall out of favor as more and more people learn the dangers and demand goes down? Thoughts? No, I don't think. First of all, I think the quantity of people that are demanding grain-free is, a minute percent of the population, a very minute percent. So I don't think we'll ever see our culture move away from grain. I just don't think we're going to see that happen. And one of the reasons why, particularly in the United States, is that all the grains, taxpayer money subsidizes the growth of these grains. This occurred during the Great Depression so that farmers wouldn't go out of business. Today, most of our farmers are not small family farms. They're owned by big corporations. And think of it like this. Big corporations take your tax dollars to spray all of your grain with Roundup and other chemicals and then feed it to you. And then big corporations take your tax dollars again, and they've mandated healthcare now. So they take your tax dollars to pay for prescription medications to treat the symptoms that are caused by the food that you're eating that don't fix the problem in the first place. So we're being double taxed through food and through medication and through healthcare for a system that's completely broken. My prediction is it should change, but will it change? What's the reality of that change? Even with consumer-driven demand of other things, I don't think we're going to see that the consumer demand is driven further than actually in the gluten-free world. I think we've already hit peak. I think a lot of people are now starting to question and challenge the gluten-free and call it trendy, and they're moving more toward ketogenic diets, and they're moving more into the next trend, to the next level of trend. This is why I like testing, because if you know you're gluten sensitive, it isn't the trends for you. Get genetically tested so that you know that it's the right thing to do, and you don't have to worry about what trends come and go. Joan, green banana flour. Yes, it is a gluten-free, grain-free option. Let's see here. Not sure what you mean, Lisa Lazola, on what test do we ask for. If you're talking about gluten sensitivity, I posted a link to genetic testing in the feed below, so you can check that out. So Marie Louise is asking, interesting comments about almonds being high in omega-6. How about the other nuts? I make hazelnut milk and bake with the leftover pulp. I also love snacking on pecan. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not that nuts are bad. They are higher in omega-6 in terms of the ratio, 6:3 ratio, which, in the human diet should be a 2-to-1 balance. But most human diets are 20-to-1. So your ratios are far skewed for most people to the level that your body uses inflammation to help you heal and to help you repair. But when your omega-6/3 ratio is very, very askew, it's instead of using a little inflammation to help you heal, your body is shooting cannons off everywhere, and so it makes it really, really hard to heal. And that's the problem with over-consuming nuts. So again, it's just, there's not a magic number, because it depends on your age, depends on your weight. It depends on, remember, omega-6 and omega-3 are both essential fatty acids. So your body can't produce them. You have to eat them. So it just depends on quantity. I've seen a lot of people struggle with chronic stiffness and pain and inflammation because they were over consuming nuts. So it's just something that you want to think about. And there's a way you can get your ratios tested. You can ask your doctor to check your percentage of omega-3 and omega-6 in your blood cells to see if you've got this skewed concentration. And that's what I would recommend that you do. If you're wanting to continue eating nuts, if your omega-6-3 ratio is tenfold too high, then you definitely want to reduce your concentration of nuts and increase your concentration of omega-3 rich foods like cold water fish. Okay, man, the questions are, I don't think I'm even making a dent. There's so many. So Joan is asking, is this being recorded? I'd love to watch, but cannot. Yes, Joan, it is being recorded, and you can, as long as you subscribe to our channel, you can get access to those recordings. So just go to youtube.com/glutenology and make sure you subscribe to my YouTube feed. Let's see here. Wondering if pesticides might be a cause for our son's issues. He cannot gain weight and has developmental issues, but the MRI test came back normal. Now we're on a waiting list for genetic testing. I don't know why you would be on a waiting list for genetic testing. If you're trying to get genetic testing for gluten sensitivity, there's no waiting list. Just click that link in the feed, and you don't have to wait at all. Unless there's some other type of genetic testing that the doctors are wanting to run in terms of the developmental issues that your son's struggling with. But the reality is that genetic issues causing developmental problems are extremely rare. And typically it's environmental exposures to toxins and poisons in mass. And that, that at least that's my experience. It's my experience in seeing people who have those types of issues. Let's see. So a lot of you are asking, I just want to be clear, a lot of you are asking me to post links for different articles that we've done or different things that we've done in the past. And I just can't get to all of them tonight, but I want to give you a resource to tap into. Again, I'm going to put this in the feed, glutenfreesociety.org. If you will go to glutenfreesociety.org, you can type in any subject in the search box and glutenfreesociety.org, and you'll pull up those articles. They're super easy to find. We have our website where it's very easy to search. So you can get in there and you can find all kinds of wonderful information about different topics if you have them. Again, we'll do our best to get to everyone, but if we don't get to yours, I don't want you to be upset with us, and just know that you can go to glutenfreesociety.org and do a search as well. Let's see here. How do you eat when you travel? Got a whole video on that whole series. So if you go back to our archives, it's YouTube or Glutenology, which is youtube.com/glutenology. There's a whole video on how I travel and what I recommend and different products and different things that you can take with you. To make that whole process much, much easier. Is it okay to stay on probiotics forever? Look, you shouldn't be having to. If you're getting regular exposure to healthy probiotics through food, through fermented food, you shouldn't have to stay on probiotics forever. And so this becomes a lifestyle issue, Pamela. And I would say, fermented food is important, but, getting dirty, getting your hands in the dirt, being outside, those are ways that we get exposure to healthy probiotics. Making sure that you get adequate vitamin D. This is one of the ways that we maintain a healthy microbiome. Making sure you're not eating food you're allergic to that can be disruptive to the microbiome. Making sure you're eating organic foods and not drinking water with chlorine added to it, because chlorine's a natural antibiotic and bromine's a natural antibiotic, and these are things that are commonly found in the city water supply. So, if you're finding yourself having to use probiotics forever indefinitely, that is a clue into the fact that you need to look at other aspects of your diet and lifestyle and just make sure you're modifying and tweaking some of those things. I mean, there's not a known danger to using probiotics. But this is also a very new field of science. And I mean, we've only really been recommending probiotics. I've only been really doing it for the last 17 years. That's a short period of time when you consider that we're just still learning about the microbiome and different species of bacteria. So the answer to your question is we don't know. We don't think it's dangerous. But again, if you're getting it naturally, that's probably going to be your best and safest bet. Let's see here. What are we celiacs not absorbing and or potentially need to supplement that is causing tooth decay? Lots of things. Vitamin C, zinc, vitamin B12, magnesium, calcium, iron. Those are some of the big ones. And you need all of those things for healthy teeth and healthy enamel formation. So that tooth decay, again, can be a nasty thing, and especially with celiac disease. So I would have your doctor check your nutritional status, have them run what's called the lymphocyte proliferation testing for vitamin and mineral deficiencies. And this way, exactly, it's because it's different for different people. It isn't the same 5 nutrients or the same 3 nutrients for everyone. It's very unique to the individual. So have your doctor test you. That would be the best advice I could give you on that front. I'm going to answer this one. I break out in hives every second day. I have celiac on a gluten-free diet, nothing processed. So Debbie, first of all, read No Grain, No Pain and apply chapter 7 and 8 in your life today. Like, get going on that immediately because you may not be gluten-free. You may think that you're gluten-free, but you may not be gluten-free, and that book will kind of guide you in a better direction. Because if you're still struggling, and if you're living on an antihistamine, antihistamines inhibit stomach acid, so they cause massive malnutrition. They can cause calcium deficiency and vitamin B12 deficiency and iron deficiency and vitamin B3 deficiency and vitamin C deficiency. And these things are important to stabilize mast cells. And mast cells are the immune cells that release histamine. So if your mast cells aren't stabilized because you're taking an antihistamine to block histamine, but doing stomach acid suppression simultaneously, you're destabilizing your mast cells in the long run and making yourself more hyperallergenic. There could be some other things too. You could have some other additional food allergies. So just celiac is not the end all be all of what a person can be reactive to. So ask your doctors to run an advanced IgE panel where they're looking at all the different foods for IgE responses, because typically hives are an IgE response, meaning an acute mediated allergic response. And don't let them just run 8 foods on you and call it even. You ask them throw the kitchen sink at you. You want to be tested for every food they know to test you for, but you need to make sure it's IgE. E is an egg. And you also want to make sure that it's a blood test, not a skin prick test. The skin prick tests aren't worth the paper that they write the answers down on it. They're just not all that accurate in my experience. Okay, we are like so out of time, and I'm running over, and but the questions just keep coming. So those of you tuning in, look, come back next week. Every Monday at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time, we do the Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain Show. It's a free-for-all Q&A at the end. So make sure, if I didn't get your question answered tonight, come back, ask those questions again next week. They're great questions, just can't get to every single one of them. On that note, we're going to wrap up tonight. I want to make sure if you know somebody with celiac, with gluten sensitivity issues, they're still struggling, share this video with them in your feed. Make sure you thumbs up or like this video as well. That helps it reach more people. Again, my mission, if you don't know what my mission is at Gluten Free Society, it's to reach 100 million chronically sick people. I can't do that alone. I need your help. And part of me being here helping you is you helping me in return. So I appreciate you reciprocating the share and the like so that we can get this message out to more and more people. Again, if you don't subscribe, make sure you hit the subscribe button. Go to glutenfreesociety.org, sign up for our newsletter, go to youtube.com/glutenology. Make sure you subscribe to our channel. And you can also subscribe on Facebook. Dr. Peter Osborne is our handle on Facebook. Thanks so much for tuning in tonight. We will be back again next week, same time, 6 p.m. Central Standard Time for Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain. Have a great week.